this module, I'll be talking about one of the most misused and misunderstood aspects of investing, performance measurement. Because measuring performance seems like it should be easy and straightforward, but it's really not, we found that this can create quite a bit of stress for clients, so hopefully we can clear some of that up. This presentation is for informational purposes only, and nothing in this presentation or anything that I say should be taken as financial advice. Watching portfolio performance can create a lot of stress. So we're going to start with some really basic questions about performance. And the first one is, what do we even mean by performance? I'm a former engineer, and engineers know that you can't take two data points and call it a trend. And yet we do that all the time when looking at investment performance. We look at performance since the beginning of the year, or a question I get a lot, what's been our performance since we started with you? The financial industry itself talks a lot about the average performance of the market, implying that the performance from an arbitrary starting point, which is usually a low point, until now, in other words, a beginning point and an end point, that indicates a trend. Now, mathematically, this makes no sense. And so that being the case, then how do we measure performance? The answer to this is really important because it not only affects our emotions, but how we measure performance, and therefore how we measure success, will heavily influence how a portfolio is designed. So to help sort through this, I put together a few key questions. And first of all, what financial goal am I tracking? This would seem obvious, but it turns out our behavior doesn't always match the logic. Second, once I've decided on the goal I care about, what aspect of it am I going to measure, and is that aspect even meaningful? Number three, how often should I check in on my portfolio? And number four, is my performance measurement telling me whether I'm on track or not? So we'll sort through all of these. Perhaps the most fundamental question, but one that is either not asked or not answered truthfully, is what goal am I tracking? If you've ever gone through an exercise that involves identifying goals, you know that goals need to be specific and measurable. So here's some specific and measurable goals. How do I pay for college? Can I retire by a specific time? If I'm retired, am I generating sufficient income to cover all of my expenses and maybe leave something to my kids? These are very specific, measurable goals. Often, however, these aren't the goals we're looking at when we attempt to track performance. Our behavior points to a very different set of goals that we probably never admit explicitly. What we really want out of investing is to see how much money we can make by winning the stock market lottery, or we keep hearing from our brother-in-law how much money he's making in crypto marijuana stocks, and so investing turns into a competition. So this is essentially goal setting 101. If we go through the effort of creating a financial plan for our life and identifying specific and measurable goals, then the method we use for measuring progress needs to be directly related to those goals in order to have any meaning. In some cases, this requires brutal honesty with ourselves about what we're really trying to get out of investing. If we're clear on what our investment goals are, let's now think about what we should measure to determine whether we're on track to accomplish those goals. As an example, let's assume we've done a financial plan and determined the amount of money we need in our nest egg so that we can retire in 10 years. In this example, I plan to save $20,000 a year in some combination of a retirement plan and regular savings, and I need my portfolio to grow by an average of 5% per year. If I accomplish both of these things, one of them is completely in my control, one of them I'm going to do my best at, I get to accomplish all of my goals. So far, so good, very clear, very specific. Now, how am I going to measure my progress during those 10 years? If I follow the vast majority of investors, I'm going to look at a collection of 505 US stocks that we call the S&P 500, mainly because the S&P 505 doesn't sound nearly as good. And then I'm going to compare my portfolio's performance to how this collection of stocks did. There are times in the past where keeping up with the S&P would help me meet my goals, and there's other times where it would have failed miserably. And all investing disclaimers mention that whatever this group of stocks did in the past is not even an indicator of what they may do in the future. But none of that matters. This is what people use as a benchmark. There is an alternative, though. I could also check my portfolio every year or so and see if I'm averaging at least 5% per year. So when the choices are viewed this way, I've got to wonder how we ever got to the point of thinking that how our portfolio compares to the market is the best way of measuring progress to our personal goals. It just doesn't make any logical sense to me. Just to hammer home that last point, I wanted to show a portfolio I created using the S&P 500 during 2018. This isn't an arbitrary portfolio that day by day, on any up days, it beat the market by 2%, and on down days, it actually beat the market by 4%. And by the end of the year, this portfolio, this hypothetical portfolio, would have been up above the S&P by 5.8%. So by almost all standards, that would be wildly successful. And yet, as you can see, that wouldn't have made any progress to anybody's financial goals. All it did was tread water for 2018. Alternatively, if you have a goal-based portfolio, the portfolio will be designed differently. All portfolios tend to be designed to stay somewhat close to their benchmark. If it's market-based, what typically happens is when the market's up, we're happy. When the market goes down, we're sad. And so we're constantly flipping between being happy and sad. On a goal-based benchmark, the portfolio is put together to try to stay somewhat close to that benchmark. If we're using 5%, I'm going to target an average return somewhere in the 7 to 8% range. Sometimes we might get a little better, sometimes we might get a little worse, but in general, it'll be designed to stay close to that benchmark. And this is typical of the difference between a market-based benchmark versus a goal-based benchmark. The next question we need to answer is how often we should be checking our portfolio. If you're entertained by watching your portfolio value move around every day, then by all means, take a look at it every day. What we're talking about here, though, is how often we should be checking with the intent of potentially making some decision. From a decision-making standpoint, if we check too often, we're really just looking at short-term noise that's created by investor emotions. If we neglect our portfolio, we may miss something that could significantly affect it long-term. So there are two ways to do this, depending on how involved you want to be in your investments. If you want to keep things really simple and just look at a performance number, how much percent did I make over a certain amount of time, then you need to allow any investments that have a time element, whether it's something like a limited partnership or in the case of my portfolios, maybe a structured note, you have to let them run their full cycle. An investment that's illiquid for 5 years will provide no meaningful performance information on a short-term basis. For the typical investor, though, 3 to 5 years is too long, and I tend to agree with that. However, in shorter time frames, we can't simply look at a performance number. We need to look for warning signs that perhaps an investment isn't fulfilling the role in the portfolio that we expected it to. Even here, though, we have to be careful not to get drawn into the temptation of judging everything based on short-term performance. All investments have multiple risks that may prevent them from performing as we hoped. And most of the time, these risks happen at different times and under different situations. That's not a big deal. Every once in a while, however, these risks may line up at the same time and create a warning sign that needs to be looked at more carefully. Maybe it's a sign that says, pull the lever and bail out. Or maybe it's just the statistics of multiple risks lining up at the same time and the investment stands a good chance of recovering quickly. The point is that nothing in the short term boils down to a number. And most investors don't like that answer. We want a simple way of measuring performance that's accurate, meaningful, and available every day, week, or month. And unfortunately, in the world in which we live and invest, this doesn't exist. This is why I always say that short-term performance, meaning less than 3 to 5 years, is always a conversation as opposed to a number. Finally, I want to talk about some ways of measuring performance that are actually effective. And this depends on whether your current financial goals are oriented towards current income or growing the portfolio for future income. At some point, it almost always boils down to income generation. If you're currently in the investment stage where you need cash from your portfolio, then the performance measurement is pretty simple. The measurement is how much cash the portfolio is generating, and success means it's generating the cash you expected. A warning sign is when cash flow falls below expectations or more principal is being burned than anticipated. Cash flow is pretty easy to measure, so it can be checked as often as quarterly. From experience, I know that even investors in the income stage experience the temptation to compare their portfolio to the stock market, and I can only encourage you to think through the logic of doing this. Investing for growth is more tricky and nearly impossible if there are not clear, measurable goals to shoot for. Ultimately, the real measure of success is whether the portfolio is meeting its average growth target. But growth targets are averages, meaning multiple years. Most of us know that investments don't grow in a straight line, so a true performance measurement takes multiple years. If we don't want to wait that long, and most of us don't, then performance requires more investigation as opposed to just looking at a number. And in my view, somewhere in the 6-month to 12-month range is reasonable for a performance conversation. The last thing I want to leave you with is emphasizing that how we measure performance strongly influences how the portfolio is designed and can actually affect quality of life in terms of how much stress we have, and how we measure performance plays a role in the ultimate success or failure of a wealth plan.